Good evening and welcome to Our Front Porch. The Front Porch has been a long-time place of learning informally and passing down your traditions. So we welcome you tonight. This idea, which Larry, we credit Larry with that, so welcome Larry again to Our Front Porch, and our guest Julia tonight. The idea came out of those great conversations, those memorable conversations, that you have someone where they generously share their insights and help you understand something that you didn't know before. And that's really the format of what we're trying to do here. And we hope that you'll play a part in that too. So we have a couple people with us. Yay, people in the building tonight. And we also have some of you out there. So we hope that you'll play a part in this conversation as well. Ask your questions, share your insights as well, and let's see if we can create one of those memorable conversations on our front porch. So, Larry, you're in charge again tonight. Are you okay with that, Julia?
No.
Somewhat. Okay, I can see how this is going to go. All right. So they've agreed to take your questions until 8:30 tonight. We have a handful of people here in the room, and we can alternate asking questions to our guests here. So you can use the comment section below, either in Facebook or YouTube, and I will filter those up here to our guests. Anything I'm missing?
No.
Okay, well, let's get started.
Thank you, Sue. Welcome back. We have a really timely topic tonight, which we're going to explore with my friend Julia Albarracin, the Dan and Laura Webb Professor of Political Science at Western Illinois University, and she is a published expert on immigration to the United States, particularly Latino immigration to the United States. And she has a book, several years old now, in particular about the impact of Latino immigration to two small Midwestern Illinois towns, Beardstown and Monmouth. And so we'll be reflecting that, and we'll be focusing some on that as a kind of starting point and theme. Anyway, welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the introduction. I'm not the Dan and Laura Webb professor right now. That's a colleague of mine. I was the first one to be named.
Okay, you were. Okay.
The first one, yeah. But it's on a rotating basis. There's a competition.
So it's 3-year basis?
3-year basis.
3-year basis?
That's right.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. But
All right. Would you like to start with any opening comment or anything you want to talk about before we have our conversation?
I can say a little bit about how I got interested in the immigration history of these two towns in the area. I moved to Macomb in 2005 when I was hired as an assistant professor in the political science department. And I was exploring the area, and I realized that they were having Cinco de Mayo celebration in Monmouth. And I was like shocked to see that right in the middle of rural Illinois. I was like, why are we having a Cinco de Mayo party in a rural community? So I started going there. I went to that party and I realized that there were a lot of Latino immigrants. Then I heard that in Beardstown, right, that town is half an hour north, half an hour south of us. Another town was also celebrating Cinco de Mayo and also Independence Day for Mexicans, which is September 16th. And I realized that there were vibrant communities in the area. A lot of people wonder about why immigrants that formerly went to big cities, right, like Chicago, New York, Miami, LA, why do they now go to small town America? And I was very curious about that question, and I can give you the answer now or tell you later.
Let's hold it for a while.
So I got curious about that question. I also got curious about how it would be for a whole Latino community to be living in the middle of the rural Midwest, right? So I wanted to understand their level of integration in society, what I call in my work incorporation, and I can tell you the difference between the two, but it's very similar. I wanted to know what kinds of jobs they had, what kind of language skills they had, what kind of incomes they were making, if they trusted their friends and neighbors. I wanted to know if they participated in politics, even if they didn't vote, if they could participate in some neighborhood organization or at churches. And I also wanted to know about the levels of discrimination that these people felt in these two towns. So I started with a big questionnaire. It had 77 questions. I got a small grant at WAU, and one of the um, internal grants, we used to call them, I don't know what they're calling anymore, the research council grants that the university gives. And I interviewed 260 people first with a survey, a short survey, but not so short, but a survey. And then I did 41 semi-structured interviews. So those were more like 1 hour conversations with 40 different people. And that's how the project developed into a book.
These interviews, did you do them face-to-face
Yes.
individually, or did you do them in groups?
They were, the surveys were individual. I did 260 of them. I had some help thanks to that grant. I had some people that helped me interview. Throughout the years, it took us like a few years to collect all the surveys. Sometimes I was going to Mexican stores and stopping people at the door and asking them if they would mind answering my questions. Other times, on 2 occasions, the Mexican consulate, for example, in Chicago, is very, very active with the Mexican community. And they try to help them. At least if they don't have documents, they want them to have something to show if they ever get pulled over, stopped or something. Nowadays, excuse me. In this day, we give driver's licenses to Mexican immigrants even without documents, or any immigrant for that matter. In the past, that was not the case, so the Mexican consulate wanted everybody to have documents. And they would come to different towns with high concentration of Mexican citizens and do one, for example, they would come for 1 weekend, right? And do passport renewals. They have a national ID called Matricula Consular. They will give them those. If you needed a birth certificate, you could process that at the consulate. And they call them the mobile consulates. And those, there were 2 of them that I went to, and they were ideal because people would start their paperwork and then they had to wait, and there was a waiting area. And in that waiting area, I could approach the persons and ask them, oh, would you mind answering some questions? And they would be happy to do that because they were already sitting there and waiting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got a lot of them too. The other ones, the interviews of 1 hour, those were individual.
So were there people reluctant to be interviewed because they thought you might be gathering information for deportation or something like that?
Well, first I gave them some reassurances. I never asked them about, in the survey, I didn't ask any questions about their immigration status.
Mhm.
I just asked them if they were citizens, if they were planning to become citizens, or they were not planning to become citizens. That was all that was asked from them. I wasn't taking the names or phone numbers or addresses or anything like that. So that was low threat.
Mm-hmm.
In the in-person interviews, I usually approach people through persons in the community. So I did what's called in social sciences a snowballing effect. I would talk to somebody and ask them if they could recommend, and I have some contacts in the community that put me in touch with people that were interested in talking to me. And those persons answered all kinds of questions and they were very open about their immigration status as well.
Has Latino immigration to the United States always been as controversial as it's been in the last few years?
No. It's been controversial for quite a few years now. But in the era of immigration restrictions, right, in the 1920s, when we passed the quota laws in 1921 and 1924, Mexican immigrants were exempted from those quotas. Because of the agricultural pressure, mostly of the Southwest, they were, for Mexicans, were needed in that area of the country. The U.S. started did an agreement with the Mexican government called the Bracero program, and that allowed for a flow of Mexican immigrants to come to the US. They will come for the season, the agricultural season, and then they will go back to their country. The expectation was that, excuse me, they were not supposed to stay. They would just come work for a few months and then go back home.
What was their official status? What were they called?
They were temporary workers.
Temporary. So they would have had a visa?
They will have a visa, they come inside the country. Employers would usually wait for them at the border, take them to work, and then they would return them to the border.
So a visa, generally speaking, is the host government's permission for you to be in that country for a period of time. Is that about?
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
Are they difficult to get now? If you were, wanted to come from Mexico to the United States, and let's suppose you wanted to settle in the Midwest for a week or 10 days or a year, would you have to go through a visa process before you came, or do you get the visa after you get here?
No, it's a very, if you want to come as a tourist, you need to go to the US consulate in the country of origin of the person.
So in Mexico City. or
In
something
Mexico
like
City, for example, you go there, you show up with your passport, they usually ask to see funds for your trip. You need to show that you have funds. Usually I remember having those interviews in Argentina, they ask you to have an international credit card, and you have to be somewhat solvent.
that. Mhm.
And they also ask all kinds of questions like, do you have friends? I mean, trying to get a sense is if you have any kind of plan to stay in the country. And if they suspect you are planning on staying in the country, you don't get the visa. Once you pass this process, you get approved, and then you have a visa stamped on your passport. Then when you show up, they give you, for example, a visa for 5 years or 10 years. Some people get it for 10 years. And then you can come to the country. When you enter the country, they give you, at the same time, a 90-day period, usually, to stay as a tourist. Beyond that point, if you overstay that period, you become an undocumented immigrant, actually.
And the only way the government would know that you were undocumented is if they found you, or somebody turned you in.
The records, I mean, technically, there's a registry when you enter the country. Nowadays, you have to, they take a picture, they take your fingerprints. So technically, it's possible for the government to say, oh, Julia came in April and she hasn't left yet and it's October. I mean, what's going on here? But in practice, no one has the time to sit down and cross all those records
Mhm.
in order to figure out what are the persons that are staying.
Okay, so a visa is necessary to visit the United States for any length of time. What's a green card do for you?
Okay, the visa is for certain countries, right? If you come from another first world country, you don't need a visa usually. If you're coming from England, be certain you don't need a visa to come to visit. That's only for the countries, it's based on reciprocity and also the countries that are more likely to have people come and try to stay.
Mhm.
The green card, you have me?
Yeah.
The green card is a permanent residency in the United States. In order to get a green card, you need to follow certain requirements.
Okay, if you came here and wanted to be a college student or a graduate student, you would require a green card.
No. If you want to come and study in the US, you have to get a student visa.
Student visa, okay.
With a student visa, your status never becomes permanent. So you can study for 20 years, which is an exaggeration, and you will never become a permanent resident or a citizen because it's a different track. That's a non-immigrant track. If you want to come and live here, most likely you can't. You have to have either a relative who lives in the US, or you have to have skills and a job offer to be in this country. You cannot just show up at the American consulate in Buenos Aires and say, I would like to move to the US. If you don't have any of those things, you cannot move to the US.
Okay, now, your research centers on Monmouth and Beardstown. Those are small towns in the Midwest, and that's unusual, originally unusual for a Latino immigrant to go to. The difference is now the location of certain kinds of job opportunities. Is that not the major point? Why I want to have more Latino immigrants in the Midwest than small towns?
That's one of the reasons. The two towns that I studied, Beardstown and Mammoth, both have meat packing plants, and that's a very attractive kind of job for. It's really not very attractive for anyone, but immigrants can do the hard labor. I don't know if you're all aware, but they're jobs that are dangerous, the conditions are wet, and people are prone to injuries. But more and more, those are jobs that Americans don't want to do. In the past, American minorities used to do those jobs, and nowadays a lot of immigrants have taken up on those jobs. But there are also other reasons why people come to find those jobs in the first place. One of them, remember I mentioned that immigrants, and that's something that we all know, used to go mostly to big cities like New York, Miami, LA, and Chicago. Those markets at some point got kind of saturated, right? And so people started exploring for other opportunities. At the same time, the more the border became militarized, the more we spent on border security, the more immigration became more permanent. Why is that? Because before it was very common for Mexican immigrants, for example, to come and harvest strawberries and then go back to their country. But as the border became more dangerous, and crossing the border, if you have to cross it, became more expensive because you have to pay somebody to cross you. When people were able to cross, they would just stay, as opposed to coming and going all the time. So instead of doing that circular migration that was so common before, migration became more permanent. So that's a paradox, what I call the paradox of the border security. And the more we militarize the border, the more immigration became permanent.
Let me go back to a minute to the point you made. Almost everybody, probably in this room, at some time read The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's book about meatpacking in Chicago. And in that case, the protagonist, the hero, was a man named Jurgis Rutkus, who was, I think, Lithuanian. And this was at the turn of the 19th century. And the situation has drastically changed. I mean, meatpacking was Chicago, and now it's diffused into smaller towns, partly, I suspect, because the smaller markets, smaller towns are not unionized, and workers are cheaper.
There were a number of transformations in the meatpacking industry, and a lot of them had to do with trying to get rid of the union. So they moved out of big cities. At the same time, big corporations like JBS is now the corporation that has Beardstown, for example, bought a lot of different plants, and they moved to areas with the excuse of being close to the animals, right? They moved to areas where they were, as you say, unions are more likely in big cities, right?
Yeah.
So they moved to areas with low traditions of unionism, and that's how they circumvented that.
You mentioned about paying somebody to help you across.
Yeah.
Is that a coyote?
Yes.
A coyote then is somebody who, for money, helps you across the border, in this case into the United States.
Yes.
Would it always be a land border, or do they help you across the Rio Grande River?
I think they could help you either way. Most of the ones that I heard about, though, is through land.
Okay, and these coyotes they're essentially involved, as far as the United States sees, in a criminal act. Is that correct?
Yes.
So.
No, it's not I don't know for coyotes. Crossing the border without inspection, unlike what people think that it's a crime, is a violation of administrative law.
Okay.
It's not criminal law.
Right, not criminal.
But I'm not sure about the coyote. That might be a different story.
Now, how does, you may not know this, how does one contact a coyote? I mean, are they just kind of hanging around the border towns? Are they advertised by word of mouth?
I imagine people here by word of mouth. It's a very important decision. They charge. Last time I asked, they were charging like $4,000 or $5,000 to cross somebody. So people have to save. Imagine making that kind of money in Mexico if you're trying to come, or in Guatemala, wherever you're coming from. It's a lot of money. So I imagine people to make such a big decision, talk to other people that have come before. Yeah, I don't think you get it from Craigslist or something like that. It's something that it's more word of mouth.
So are most people who come from Mexico into the United States
Yeah.
to work or to stay a while, are they coming that way, or are they flying in with a cheap plane ticket to a place like Chicago and then taking a bus to Monmouth or something like that? How does that work?
Unlike what most people think, most immigrants come through airports, right? Even undocumented ones. And most undocumented immigrants, it's not that they don't go through inspection at the border, but rather that they overstay their visas. Remember my example of coming as a tourist from Argentina. If I decide to overstay my 90 days, then I will become undocumented. And if I work, I would be working also without a work permit.
Do American companies like the meat packers have a kind of informal way of enticing workers into the United States?
I was told at one point that they were recruiting at the border, but I could never find evidence of that. I know, however, that the way it works is through family members or friends. If you have a friend who's working and they tell you, oh, you can come here and make, I don't know, 40,000 a year, which is still a good salary compared to other jobs, right?
Yeah.
And work here, so they tell a relative, they tell a family member, they tell a friend, and everything that.
It would be sort of unusual for a whole family to move at the same time.
Most of the time, the men come first.
That was the experience we talked with my grandfather from Sicily in the 1890s. His father had come, then a brother, then he came. Now, he only intended to stay a while, which technically they're called birds of passage or something like that. Is that fairly common among the immigrants you studied? They only intended to stay a while?
Especially when they first come, the idea is to come, save money, and build their home in Mexico or something of that nature, and then they end up seeing that it gets harder and harder to come back, especially when they have children. Many times the children are, American citizens, and they have their friends here, they go to school here, so it gets harder and harder to go back. But some people are still saying that they're gonna retire in Mexico. Yeah.
Does the child of an immigrant who is not documented, born in the United States, does that child automatically become an American citizen?
Yes, that child is automatically an American citizen, it doesn't need to become one.
So the status of the parent, technically speaking, from that child's citizenship status, doesn't make any difference?
No.
Okay.
So far. They have tried to, they've been talking about changing that during the Trump administration, but they were not able to. They have to change the constitution.
When you mentioned them, we're going to pause for questions. Do you have any questions, Sue?
Not online.
Okay. What you mentioned that when the border became militarized, when did that start? Was it the 1960s or 70s, or a particular president, or?
The process that I'm talking about is more from the last 30 years. Before the border was a very fluid concept. The Border Patrol was created in the 1920s, I believe it was 1924, for example, and there was more formal, controls at the time. But the militarization that I'm talking about is in the last, especially 30 years. And it became worse after September 11th with the fear of terrorism and fear that terrorists could go through the borders. And it continued, like if you think about the recent, even during the Obama administration, when they were talking about immigration reform that can, usually immigration, when people say, oh, comprehensive immigration reform. What do they mean by that? What they mean some sort of solution for the 11.5 undocumented immigrants that are in the country. And usually it comes attached to nowadays to some sort of increased funding for the border, for border security, border patrol. In the case of the Trump administration, it was the wall that now it's not being built anymore.
Well, since you brought it up, let's talk for contemporary for a minute. Has the border wall had much of an impact on immigration?
Well, the research I have seen shows that no, that it doesn't have much of an impact. If people are determined to come, they're gonna come. And it has more of an environmental impact than other kinds of impacts.
I've heard it said when I was teaching American history that immigration traditionally was always kind of a push-pull sort of thing. There were things going on in the home country pushing people out, and there were things going on in the host country that were pulling people in. Is that the case with the Latino immigrants that you studied?
Yes.
So economic situations in Mexico have a dramatic effect on pushing people out?
Yes. In recent years, after NAFTA, and despite what we hear from some opinions in the US, NAFTA had a very prejudicial impact on Mexico. They used to be self-sufficient in producing corn, and now they're not anymore. The only crops that do well, I don't know if technically it's a crop, but are avocados. And so a lot of farmers, like I spoke to a lot of people that were formerly farmers and they couldn't survive as farmers and they ended up leaving Mexico because of that reason. Yeah, so there is a push factor. There's also the wage differential, right?
Mhm.
Like the fact that if you come here, even if you don't have a great salary, you can save $500 and send it back to Mexico, and that goes a long ways in Mexico.
Does the Mexican government have any concerns about losing potentially productive parts of their population?
They do at times. They also depend on the remittances that immigrants send. So they don't, I've never seen any determined effort to fight them either.
Anything, Sue?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I have a question, Julia.
Yeah,
I have a friend who was community development director in Columbus Junction, Iowa for probably 20 years.
yeah.
And Columbus Junction has a Tyson plant nearby and has had a really long span of Latino and Latina immigration to the point where they have second, third, fourth generation. I don't know if you're familiar with Columbus Junction, but they have, third and fourth generation Hispanics living in the community. So when you go down Main Street, half or more of the signs are in Spanish for the businesses because they're owned by Hispanics. They have more Hispanics than Anglos graduating from the high school there in Columbus Junction. So I guess my question would be, do you see, I would think that situation would be very different than a community where you're only dealing with like first and second generation Hispanic immigrants. So I'm wondering, do you see a difference among the communities that you've looked at, Monmouth, Beardstown, and if you're familiar with Columbus Junction in terms of how entrenched the Hispanic community and how accepted it is in the community?
Thank you for that question, John. I don't know the details about Columbus Junction, but what I can tell you is that usually the more established communities have different characteristics. The people tend to be more organized, have more community organizations.
Mhm.
They tend to have better incomes. There are a lot of them that are entrepreneurs, right, and they have their own businesses. In general, they tend to be, in the terms of that I use in my book, they tend to be more incorporated. These immigrants that we're talking about here arrived in the last 20 or so years. So they're a lot more recent. So their community attachment is not so strong, their language skills are weaker, they don't have as many generations in the country as you say happens in Columbus Junction. So it has some impacts. That's like I'm talking a little bit about the old school, the old Chicago school, right? That talked about Park and his colleagues that talk about the assimilation paradigm and all the emphasis, not that all the emphasis is put on that, but if you look at first generation and compare that to second generation and third generation, right? You see an evolution, and according to what they used to say, the farther from the original first generation, the more people start behaving like Americans. And the idea at that time was that you just assimilate, right? And all your culture disappears, your language disappears, and you just become one more American, which is not the paradigm that we use nowadays. But they always paid attention, that was my point, to the difference, the different levels of integration across generations of immigrants.
Is it fair to say that, on theory at least, that assimilation or incorporation is easier in a smaller town or a larger city?
I still have questions about that, because there are advantages to being in a small place like the ones I saw. And I was telling you earlier why people move here, besides the reason that there's a job. The communities in our area have low crime, something that in Chicago you don't see, right? So they're safe communities, so people go there. I was asking them, why did you come here? Because there are no gangs, because there are no drugs, because the cost of living is lower. And because, I mean, they don't say this, but the reality is that these towns that immigrants choose are towns that are losing immigration. They're at the brink of, I'm not gonna say disappearing, but they're going down in the number of population. If it weren't because of immigration, they would be decreasing in size, they wouldn't be growing. And they're revitalized, right, with the influx of immigrants in the area. But in terms of the question as to whether it's easier to get incorporated, it depends on how you measure incorporation. Like, for example, certain things that at first help you, right? If you arrive in a community and you have a big group of co-ethnics, right? I arrive in, say, New York, and I go move into a little Argentina area where all people from Argentina are living, right? It's gonna help me in the beginning, right? It's gonna help me because I'm gonna find maybe my first place to live. I'm gonna find my first job, right? They're gonna help me out the way they can. But there's gonna be a point, and this is something that the literature says, where in order to broaden, I don't want to say broaden my horizons, but like improve my situation, right? If I want to get out of that small retail job that I'm in, and I want to get a better job, I'm gonna have to go out of my circle, right? Because my small circle is in the same area with the same jobs, same people. So, like living in little Argentina as a new immigrant is like a double-edged sword because for once it helps you at first, right? Feel more at home and have people that think like you, but at the same time, at some point it's a limit to the resources. One of the things that I saw in my book, for example, is that one of the main people that were doing the greatest were people that had Anglo friends. And you don't know what comes first, right? If it is that they make Anglo friends because they have a good job and in their job they made a lot of friends and some of them were Anglos, or if because they had Anglo friends they got a better job. You don't know what comes first exactly in social sciences, right? But the reality is that there are advantages and disadvantages to both, right? Like you don't have a big community of co-ethnics in Monmouth, maybe, but at the same time, the cost of living is gonna help you, right? The low crime, safe area, no gangs, so it's safe for the children. It's appealing for the families.
My grandfather, when he came to the United States, eventually settled in St. Louis in a Sicilian neighborhood.
Okay.
But I'm not sure my grandfather ever became incorporated, he never spoke really good English.
Mhm.
The one thing he mentioned, and we'll get into this, is the importance of the Roman Catholic Church. They were Catholics. But the priests were invariably, he said, Irish or German, not Italian, not Sicilian. And so he always went to church, but he was always a little standoffish about that. It wasn't until the family moved to Columbia, Missouri, 125 miles west of there in 1919, where they were the only Sicilian family in town, that he was forced to
Open up.
associate and open up with other kinds of people.
Mhm.
And he prohibited his children from speaking Italian at home. I mean, they could swear in Italian, but they never spoke.
Mhm.
They didn't know the language at all. They knew the customs, and none of them ever wanted to go back to Sicily. You couldn't have driven my grandfather back to Sicily. I mean, he had a brother who went back, but he would never have anything to do with going back there. Of course, he came from poverty, and he came from privation, he said, and he became a success in the United States. Were the people in the powers that be in Monmouth and Beardstown 20 years ago, were they aware of what was going to be happening in the town? Did they have any inkling that the meat packers were going to be pulling in people for jobs and changing the demographics of those towns?
I doubt they knew that would happen. They started seeing some immigrants in Mammoth. They started before, maybe in the 80s. They started seeing some immigrants, but it was only a few groups of families. But I don't think they foresaw that. And later on, after 2007, there's also an important influx of families from West Africa, families from, for example, there are two, not really large, but communities of people from Myanmar. Like there's some in Mammoth and now some, a new community in Beardstown. And the reason that these new immigrants are coming is that these other immigrants, unlike many of the Mexican and other Latinx immigrants, have visas and have papers to work. So I don't know if you all remember that there was an immigration raid, I think it was 2007 in Beardstown. And after that, it was really with the cleaning company that was doing the cleaning, not the actual plant. But after that, they started scrutinizing papers of immigrants more. So some people left there, some of them first went to Mammoth, and then Mammoth started doing the same thing. So after that, they started recruiting, and both, I think, are heavily recruiting immigrants from West Africa that come with visas as refugees.
Does this make it harder for Latino immigrants to cultivate this with the West Africans and the people from the North? Does it make it easier? Does it muddy the waters, make things more complicated, or?
To incorporate or to get
Yeah,
jobs?
to incorporate.
Some people have looked at that issue. I didn't interview any West Africans or people from Myanmar. I know many stories from working with the community, with a nonprofit organization that works in the area. But I think eventually they will realize that cross-ethnic cooperation is for the best, right? But I know there were some hard feelings at one point about how, well, imagine if you're undocumented and you lose your job and then they replace you with somebody coming from another place. It's always like a little bit of tension at first. But I think eventually they will come together as one. And churches, you mentioned churches before, that a lot of the French-speaking Africans, many of them are Catholic, and they go to a Catholic church, and there they interact with the Spanish-speaking community and also the English-speaking community, the other community.
I'm wondering, small Midwestern town, is it more difficult to incorporate if you're Roman Catholic in a town that's probably originally mostly Protestant?
It's again like so, it depends on how you measure incorporation, because I mean the Catholic Church is so important in Beardstown and Mammoth. If you go to the Spanish Mass, it's overflowing with people and lots of young children, right, young parents, and I think it helps them a lot. Like it's a way where a place where they all come. It's one of the first institutions that you come in contact with, right, in a new society if you are religious and attend services. I think the churches have a very important role, but there are also other churches working as well. Recently, I was working on a project to disperse rents, mortgage, and utilities assistance to immigrants in the area when they are expanding to the Chicago area almost. But I work with some churches in Beerstown that are Protestant, and they're also doing a lot of community work, and they're they're very close to each other. The community members are close to each other, and they seem to help them in their integration as well. So I guess, I don't know, it could be better or it could be worse. It depends.
If you were, so, if you wanted to become a United States citizen after you came to the United States,
Yeah.
what are the steps? What are the processes to becoming a United States citizen? You need an immigration lawyer to do that, or can you do it?
You need an immigration lawyer. But first, as I was telling you before, do you want to show this chart?
Yeah. Can you show the chart too?
And then we do have a question at some point.
So basically, that's a chart that I like to use to explain the immigration process. But basically, I need my glasses because the print is tiny. But I start most of my presentations asking people, right, and the audience, if I ask you, why do we have 11.5 million undocumented people in this country? What is the answer that I get? Dana, any guesses? Why don't people just get their papers? Why
It's
don't
difficult, hard to do that.
It's hard. What was that?
It's too hard to do.
If they wanted to do it?
It's difficult for them to do that.
Difficult.
Difficult.
Difficult. Mhm.
Is there a fee for you getting the papers?
It's expensive. Anything else? You need lawyers sometimes? Well, this
Can
chart
you sponsor
shows,
too?
what was that?
Sometimes you get sponsor to go with that.
You can need a sponsor, yeah. I run into that. Basically, what this chart shows you is that if you don't have a family member, right, who is a citizen or a resident, or you don't have skills defined as a college degree and a job offer and an employer willing you to sponsor you, there's virtually no way for you to become documented in this country. So it's not just that there's a line and they don't want to wait in line, or it's difficult, or it's expensive. All those things are true, but the reality is that if you want to come here and you're a plumber, right, and you have no family in the US without a college degree, it's virtually impossible for you to get your papers. So if you cannot get a work visa, you cannot become resident and you cannot become citizen, because it's like steps, right? So if you want to look at this chart in detail, the first question when you come to the US is, do you have a relative? Do you have a family member? If your relative is a citizen, we see on the top, the top part, if your relative is a citizen, it can take you between 6 to 7 years, which is the fastest to become a citizen. And if you are not a close relative, then it can take you up to 28 years to become a citizen. If your relative is a lawful permanent resident, then it takes longer, 11 to 13 or 14 to 20. If you don't have a job offer, for example, if you have skills but not a college degree, you can have two other options, I would say. One is if you're a star, right? A star athlete or a music star, musical star, or you're a Nobel Prize winner, then you can come. But other than that, or you can have $1 million to invest. That way it will take you to. Now, outside of that, if you don't have a college degree, we don't consider you skilled. So how many of the immigrants that we see in this country working in restaurants, agriculture, hotels, meat packing plants, how many of them do you think have college degrees? They don't need them, right? To do those jobs, no one needs a college degree to work in a restaurant. So that's what, when people talk about the immigration system is broken, that's what they mean to say. They mean that our economy demands a sort of labor, right? That is low skills or with certain skills, but not high skilled labor. We also demand high skills separately, right? But our economy demands people that can work agriculture, construction, services, but our law is created for people like me that come here with a PhD, but I got my PhD in this country, but when I apply for a job here, right, I'm in that category where I have a job offer and I'm employed and all those things. So,
Is that true, the process that you just mentioned, for all potential immigrants? If you're from Belgium or
Sweden.
yeah,
from Korea or all, this is a blanket thing.
yes.
Okay. How much of a role in fulfilling these kinds of things is knowing the English language a factor?
The English language becomes a factor when you become a citizen.
When you take the citizenship written test, as you showed me, do they do it in your native language or only in English?
In English, unless you've been in the country, unless you have certain age, I don't know in the life, but I think it's, if you're above 65 and you've been in the country for 20 years or something, I don't remember exactly the numbers, you're exempt. Other than that, you have to take the test in English.
If you have a criminal record in your home country or in the United States, does that preclude you from citizenship?
Yeah. Immediately.
Even if you've served your sentence?
I think those cases are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, but usually if you have a criminal background, you have to pass criminal background checks. And having served a sentence doesn't get rid of your criminal background.
One, I can remember hearing Donald Trump in 2015 when he announced his candidacy for the presidency, mentioning the bad people coming in over the border. He said, I'm sure there must be some good ones out there. I mean, is there a connection between immigration increase and drug smuggling? Is it much of a connection, or is there any? And what do we know about it?
I don't know much about that at all. I don't think there's a connection.
Even if you have a coyote taking you across the border, they wouldn't be forcing you to carry some drugs in as part of the price?
I never heard of anything like that.
So the border became militarized in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Was it because of a sudden increase in immigration from that part of the world, or was this something else? I know the 9/11 was a factor. Was there a sudden upsurgence of immigration from Mexico and Central America about 30 years ago?
30 years ago was 1990. It started a little before that, but let me tell you, we created our own problem with undocumented immigration. Let me tell you why. I was talking earlier about how in the 1920s we created the quota laws and immigrants from Mexico were exempted from those quota laws. So we started a flow of immigration through the Bracero program that we would bring immigrants on a temporary basis to work in agriculture and then send them back. That was not very realistic, right? Because people come here, meet somebody, like the weather, whatever that might be, they like to stay, and people ended up staying. And there was a flow, right, created for 40 years almost that the Bracero program was in place. No, it wasn't 40 years, it was a little less than that, but no, it was close to 40. Anyway, so we created a flow of immigration. When in 1965, right, the 1965 Act is celebrated as a liberal immigration reform. And it was liberal in the sense that it got rid of the quota laws. The quota laws had been established to keep immigrants like your grandfather or your
Exactly.
father
Eastern
from
and Southern Europeans.
Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans out of the country. So what we did, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, but we said, okay, we're gonna take the census from 1890 and we're gonna assign quotas in the proportion of the people that the people had at that time. And think about it, we were like 30 years later assigning the quotas based on that census because that was the kind of population makeup that the people passing the law liked. So 65, that's great, we got rid of that. The problem was that when it came to Mexican immigration, right? Well, instead of having quota laws, before we had qualitative quotas, right, and quantitative quotas. Then we got rid of the qualitative. We didn't say anymore, okay, we don't want this many, we don't know people from here or there, but we had quantitative quotas. So we gave for Western Hemisphere countries 120,000 spots. Mexico counts among the Western Hemisphere countries. The year previous to giving 120,000 spots to all the countries, including Mexico, we apprehended 150,000 Mexican immigrants. And then 10 years later, I think it was in 76, we decided the cap for Mexican immigration to the US would be 20,000 a year. So we set these limits, right, that were completely off with the reality that we were seeing about immigration. We created that tradition of having all that immigration, and then all of a sudden we wanted to encapsulate it in a 120,000 cap, and then we lowered that to 20,000. So in 1965, when that was created, there wasn't really a preoccupation with illegal immigration. It was not discussed. If you look at the debates of that bill, it was not discussed. But 5 years later, they started noticing the problem of undocumented immigrants from Mexico. And the problem was that we created those caps, and there was already an established flow of immigrants from Mexico. And that's how we created the problem of undocumented immigration, basically.
It's kind of what, the law of unintended consequences, or was this deliberate?
I don't know, Marxists will tell you that that's more convenient for employers because if you don't have documents, you can't defend your rights, and there's when you're being a reserve army of labor for the employer that can pay you whatever they want and treat you the way they want, but.
I've never been in a meatpacking plant. What are the conditions like? I mean, I know it's hard work, but is it unsafe? Is it unsanitary? Do people get hurt on the job? Are they covered by insurance with their income? Or, how do things work there?
I've never been in one either, but I can tell you from the stories I heard, it's very wet, it's slippery. Sometimes you have to carry like a whole bag on your shoulders. You can get cut if you're cutting. It's a tough job. They have benefits, I think, at the plants. I know that we're a little strict with their rules for COVID. Like when people got COVID, they would stay home, but they would make them come back to work 3 days after having no fever. And sometimes people would feel like terrible for weeks right after having COVID. But they would have to report to work.
Now, men and women work pretty
Yes.
much together. There's no distinction particularly. This is not just a men-only work,
No, they're women too.
but they do not hire children. That's against the law, is that correct?
Correct.
Under the age of 14 or something like that.
16, I think. 14 when you work for your family, I think.
I think, when you wrote your book, Beardstown had about 6,000 people in it. Was that something like that, 7,000 people?
Yeah.
And you had, I think, an immigrant population, a Latino population of about 33%.
Mhm.
Right? And yet, I think you said in the book that relations were better there than they were in Monmouth, which is a larger town with a smaller percentage of that population. Is that local leadership, or is that simply happenstance? And how do you explain? You would think that race relations would be worse in a place where there were more higher percentage of the population.
Yeah. Well, I think Pearson approached the immigration in a very different way. For example, the school district established a dual language program. So children, both, Anglo children and Latino children were taking classes alternating between Spanish and English throughout the day. At one point, they cut that short. It used to be up to middle school, and then I think they made it shorter. But the response of the town was very different. They were more open-minded about it. They made an effort to accommodate the children, take advantage of the opportunity, right? Because what a great opportunity. Some people, would refuse to send their kids to a dual language program, but you can have your children be raised bilingual, right? When you have no idea of any other language. And even if we had some problems, in Beerstown, they burned down the Latino bar on the square, and they left the burning cross at the door of the bar. So after that, the relations between Anglos and Latinos were pretty tense for a while. I think the town has overcome that now. Mammoth, without that rocky past, still I don't know, when I talk to the people in Beerstown, people in Beerstown are more connected with each other. They have more groups of parents, of clubs, different community organizations, and in Mammoth, they're not there. They have a Mexican store. They have a couple, but there's one Mexican store where Elena, the owner, is like a social broker that brings solutions. I talk to her all the time because each time there's a problem, something that we can bring help to the people. I talk to her, but there's really no organization of society, civil society beyond that. So I think they're more incorporated in the town where they're a larger proportion of the population.
Can we ask
In the, yeah, so-
sorry, I have a question related to your last
Yes.
comment, so I'm going to jump in. What is,
Go.
do you know, Julia, the percentage of the total population that are immigrants in the meatpacking plants in Monmouth and Beardstown?
The numbers, no.
Okay.
They're very secretive. I try to get that information, but they don't give you a roster with the ethnic breakdown. Yeah, no, I don't know it. Sorry.
Did you do any research in the quad cities, because they have a large population too?
Yeah, no, I didn't include the positives in my research.
It'd be interesting to see why they came there. I don't think there's a meatpacking plant there, any kind of large.
Yeah,
Maybe something Justin, not far
I
away.
think it's-
Justin, I think was one there.
Yeah.
In Monmouth, is there a meatpacking plant?
Yeah,
Oh, there is. Oh,
Yeah.
I missed that.
I didn't know that. Is it Excel? Or-
yeah. I don't know what it's called now because they change names every 4 years.
One question,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if I can interrupt. I thought it was interesting, Julia, what you said in terms of how difficult it is for somebody who doesn't have relatives here and who doesn't have a college degree to possibly become a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. And yet we have a lot of jobs, meatpacking being among them, that we need workers, and many Americans don't want those jobs.
Yeah.
There's a reality of it. Agriculture is another example. So I have an unfair question. And also we need people with skills in crafts, electricians and plumbers and, these type of tradespeople. But they're almost prohibited, they're almost eliminated from consideration as immigrants to the US. So I have an unfair question. How would you change the US policy to deal with that dilemma?
There was a change on immigration policy. My other book is about immigration in Argentina. And there was a change in immigration policy that at the time I criticized, and it was restrictive at the time for there, because in Argentina before, you had to meet certain requirements, but with showing that you had an occupation, you could technically get your papers. And then they decided in 1994 to ask for a job offer in order to be able to get a visa and then a permanent residency. And despite the fact that it might be a double-edged sword, because people could fake documents and they could create an industry of fake job offers and stuff like that. But if you want to keep it realistic and according to the job market, right, you could do at least a mixed system where you accept, if there's demand for this type of jobs, then we can accept more immigrants in that area, or do something like Canada, right? In Canada, they take into account the labor demands and they assign you points based on the kind of occupation that you can have, and they take into account education, language skills. But if you're a plumber and they need plumbers in Quebec, then you can be accepted to move to Quebec. Yeah, so maybe we could do something like that, make it more, based on labor shortages or something like that.
But what, are there cases, is there a pattern of Latino immigrants in the two towns you studied moving into supervisory or management positions in the meatpacking plants?
A few.
It's not happening very quickly or in very large
Some
scale.
are advanced, yeah, I made a few that advanced. Yeah, but most of the managerial jobs are Anglos. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that perhaps the major thing to accomplish for Latino immigrants in the towns you're talking about, and in general, but the first thing they need to do is maybe learn English as fast as they can? Or is it improving their economic status, or is it finding housing? What's the first thing, the most important thing? If you're thinking about being incorporated, that is being accepted part of the community, is skill with language the most important thing?
They can find jobs without great language skills. I would say, looking to the future, the best thing they can do is put their kids through college. If you're looking at the, real incorporation of the family and prospects, economic prospects for the whole family. And it's a goal, believe me, many of them have that goal in mind. They have the goal of putting the kids through college. And that's when it's gonna really lift them out of poverty every day. I know.
People who return periodically from here to Mexico,
Yeah.
what do they bring with them back to Mexico? What kind of traits, what kinds of habits, what kind of patterns of life do they bring back there? And is that a problem for the local Mexican population?
I don't know much about that specific area. I know that a lot of people that live in the US, for example, bring back money to Mexico. They make donations and they go back to their town or origin, and they build new sewers for the town, or build a new school and things of that nature. But in terms of habits that they bring back to Mexico, it's not something that I ever studied, so I cannot help you there.
Are there any patterns of where the people who are coming from Mexico come from that are common? Are they coming from states of Mexico that are agricultural or poverty stricken or close to the border, or?
For what what I saw, they were not, the people that I interviewed were not coming really from states that were close to the border, but many of them were coming from states that are pretty rural in nature, so I assume that they were impacted by NAFTA maybe, and many of them that I spoke with were formerly farmers and they couldn't survive anymore on their farms. But, I mean, I mentioned in my book the main states that people come from, but also people from other states. So
Okay,
it's-
sure.
Yeah,
If you were going to be coming into the United States to work without documentation, you cannot expect to enter at a regular border crossing, is that fair? You almost have to come across with a Coyote,
no, you can come as a tourist instead,
okay?
it's a better plan,
And the tourist gives you, is it 90 days?
yeah,
So if you're crossing, say, in San Diego, and there's the border, at the border checkpoint,
yeah.
and you declare that you're going as a tourist, they give you a tourist visa or a tourist document, correct?
They stamp your passport and they give you, yeah,
So when you get then to the place where you're going to work, let's say you've got a brother in Monmouth,
yeah,
and that person has sent you information about how to get there and the job and so forth.
yeah.
What does the employer look for in your papers, in your documentation? What are they supposed to look for?
That's the tricky part. Until 1986 in this country, we had no sanctions for employers. And in 1986, we said employers have the obligation of doing what I call a superficial check. So they don't go very deep. They just need to look at your social security number. I mean, I imagine they do like a W-9, which is that form where you put your social security number, name and address, but they don't need to go very deep.
And you can use somebody else's social security number, can you not?
Yeah.
They don't really check on that. It's a fairly easy matter to check on.
It's hard to figure that out, actually. They will have to have access to all the social security numbers. I don't know if they have access to that. But if you have a social security number attached to a name, so you have to work with the other person's name, it's not enough with a social security number. Yeah.
I presume the people working in these plants get a paycheck, they don't get paid in cash.
Yeah,
Okay, so they have to issue the check to somebody's name.
yeah.
And they withhold taxes? I mean, like the
Yeah.
withholding tax?
Yeah, it's like any other job, like you can decide how much you want them to withhold, how much you're gonna pay at the end of the year.
What does INS do? Immigration
INS.
Naturalization Service.
INS doesn't exist anymore, but the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services is the agency that replaced the INS, and they process basically all the visas, permanent residencies, citizenship applications, and they also have the border patrol. I think, no, they're part of Homeland Security, but they're not part of the USCIS. That's a separate agency, but they do all those things basically.
Do the INS and the Border Patrol report to the same bosses, or are they separate agencies? I mean, one is an
Yes.
enforcement agency.
Yeah,
A
but
law
they're all
enforcement
without
agency.
Homeland Security. After September 11th, we created the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know if you remember. And we put all the immigration related staff in that Department of Homeland Security.
What are the differences between the immigration policies of Obama for 8 years and Trump for 4 years?
Obama passed DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. That was a program that tried to benefit children who had no documents but came to the country before the age of 16, if they had been in the country between 2007 and 2012, and if they had no criminal record and they were studying high school, had finished high school. Trump tried to destroy it, but he couldn't. So Obama passed that program. Obama had promised immigration reform. He didn't deliver that at all. When I talked to the community, they were pretty disappointed in President Obama, I have to say. They were pretty hurt that he had promised immigration reform and that never happened. But he did DACA. I think that's the best thing he did. He deported more people than any other president in American history. So that wasn't so good for the immigrant community. Trump deported in large numbers. The difference between them was more qualitative than quantitative, in the sense that Trump maybe didn't deport as many people, but he started deporting people with minor offenses, like driving under the influence will get you deported. And Obama was trying to focus on serious crimes.
What are dreamers?
Dreamers are the beneficiaries of this program that I told you about, DACA, are sometimes called dreamers. And dreamers refers to the DREAM Act, which is a piece of legislation introduced by our Senator Durbin in our state in 2001. And the idea was to give a path to citizenship to all those young people that came without documents when they were children. But it passed the House at one point, but it didn't pass the Senate. So it never became law. And there's still different versions. There's a Dream and Promise Act of 2019 that Congress is dealing with now.
Would a major reform of immigration in the process of path towards citizen? And it's true, is it not, that a significant number of immigrants to this country are not really interested in becoming American citizens. They want to work for a while, make some money, go back home, okay? But is there a way we can make, reasonable way, that we can make the path to citizenship simpler and easier and cheaper?
I think a lot of people that come here want to stay, right? Like they dream at some point with going back to their country and they end up staying. But I wouldn't say that the majority don't want to stay here because it's a big decision to make. But we can streamline the process by first making it shorter, the period between when you come here, let's say you come with a visa, then you get your green card, let's say a year into your visa. So 5 years you need to wait to become a citizen. And so it takes up to 6 years to become a citizen. The process is very pricey. You don't need a lawyer to become a citizen. I did it myself, but it's close to $1,000 in fees. So I can afford it, but other immigrants, it's a little harder to afford. There are waivers for that. If you prove you have a certain income, they can waive you from paying that fee. I think it was $770 or something like that. But we can make the naturalization process easier for sure.
Is it in the interest of the United States to do that?
I don't know who says what the interest of the United States is.
I mean, do
The
we have-
voters, if it's the voters, then yes, we could make it a little easier because people voted for a party that was proposing some sort of more humane immigration system.
I mean, it seems to me, and I'm no expert in this, but if somebody comes to this country, works hard, obeys the laws, a good resident, that would be in our interest to have them become citizens. They pay taxes, they could participate in the process. They wouldn't be a permanent underclass necessarily.
The problem is that they may benefit one political party over the other political party, and that is the problem.
But as people become more affluent, if they become more affluent, the tendency is to become a little more conservative and maybe vote in a different party. I mean, for example, I'm certainly no expert, but it seems to me that in Florida, there are a considerable number of Cuban voters who are Hispanic, are Republicans.
Yeah.
Now, maybe they've been here 2 or 3 generations and have made money, or maybe in the first place, they didn't flee Cuba because of an economic privation. They went together with Castro, so they were wealthy in the first place. But
Yeah.
isn't that a possible scenario that could happen in the future?
Eventually.
Of course, somebody with political clout will have to show some courage, would they not, to do something like that, to advocate something like that. How many, do you have any way of knowing how many people in Monmouth or Beardstown who are immigrants have become citizens and stayed there?
And stay there?
Become permanent citizens of the community?
No, I can look at my numbers, but I don't remember off the top of my head the number that we're planning on becoming citizens.
I mean, they can become voters and they become members of the school board, or they can become, city councilman or something like. Are there Hispanic, Latino members of the police force in your city now, or that you know of?
I don't know, I don't think so,
How about teachers?
yeah. In Beardstown, in Monmouth, I don't know, I'm gonna do a workshop in the Monmouth schools in a few weeks, and I did one in Beardstown a month ago or so. And I compared, you can racial profile by looking at the names, at least I can't, right? I can tell which names are Spanish names. And in Beardstown, there are a lot of teachers that are Latinos. And in Monmouth, I didn't see many names at all. Yeah.
Do you know if that, on our very campus, are they preparing teachers to go out to public schools who have some sensitivity toward his Latino concerns or language skills or stuff like that?
In the programs here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Gloria Delaney Barman and Carla Pachotto, for example, work with the English as a second language teachers or bilingual education teachers. They're very sensitive to racial issues and the plight of Latinx populations.
I wonder if our law enforcement administration program has that kind of interest too.
I know there's a Spanish class for law enforcement. So I do take a Spanish class. I don't know who teaches, I think Coyote teaches it, I don't remember who teaches it. I never had a Spanish class. There are a lot of Latinx students in law enforcement, I can tell you that because I met a lot of them, but they complain a little bit.
I'm missing anybody out here? Let's talk a little bit about working conditions.
I have a little bit of water.
Here, I didn't drink out of this.
There's a question here, Larry.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you were thinking of immigrating from Mexico, Mexico City is a very large city, millions of people. Why would you not go there versus go to the United States? I mean, what would be the driving force to go one way or the other?
The wage differentials, I would say, that a dollar is worth more in Mexico. Let's say in Mexico, in a month, you make, and I'm just making this up, okay, because I'm not sure about the levels and salaries, but let's say in Mexico, you could make $600, and in the US, with a not very good salary, you could make $1,400. So that money, if you can save money and send it back to Mexico, it goes a long ways in Mexico. So that's the big advantage.
It's a big driving force, yeah.
Yeah,
That's a
but
terrific
there's
invention.
also a rural migration, rural urban migration within Mexico as well, right? People that go to Coyote. Yeah.
Is there a major pay differential between working in the meatpacking plants in the towns we've talked about and working as an agricultural worker in California? I know one's seasonal, but I mean, you're outside, you're in kind of a settled community, so to speak, there, where the people are used to hiring you on a seasonal basis. on the standpoint of economic welfare, are you better there or are you better in a meatpacking plant?
I honestly don't know, Larry. I don't know
Or-
the Southwest.
I mean, are there studies that indicate the kind of social integration that might be in those communities in California as opposed to what's going on in the meatpacking plant?
If we're talking about seasonal jobs, the integration is gonna be better in a permanent job, right?
Unless they make more money in a seasonal job than they do in a year in the meatpacking
Yeah,
plant.
but
Maybe it's safer, I don't know.
But they won't be very integrated in that community if they go back half of the year to Mexico or something.
One of the scandals, it seems to me, of the current situation in the last 4 or 5 years, how did the separation of children from their parents come about? I mean, what's the process there? Why did that happen? And did it happen before? I mean, it surely did, but not to the same scale, maybe.
Apparently, it started a little before the Trump administration. I didn't really look about it, but I don't remember exactly the details. But it became a large-scale issue in the Trump administration, together with the fact that in order to keep it clean, they were trying not to keep many records of it. So with the drawback that after they separated, the kids didn't really know who their parents were. And if you work with this population, names repeat themselves a lot in Mexico. So if you have a Jose Garcia or Juan Perez, right, who had children, probably in a sample, in 100 people, there are probably 6 Perez, 6 Garcia, 6 Lopez. So they made a big mistake, so that it was inhumane to separate them to start with. But in addition to that, they could have done it in a more organized way, and they didn't. But I thought it was atrocious.
What would happen if the Biden administration, by its own accord, by an executive order, came across with, say, a year amnesty? From this day forward for a calendar year, people who are here illegally can start the process of becoming citizens if they choose, or people here undocumented can get along without documentation. What effect would that have? Would it create a rush across the border? Would it settle things down? Would it bring justice? What would it do?
People that oppose amnesties say it will create the incentive for people to come illegally, but any amnesty, I mean, people are smart about it, so you're gonna say, whoever was in the US on January 1st, right, can stay now and get a residency or a green card or something of that nature. The fact that people would think, I mean, we haven't had one of those in 40 years, so.
Long time, yeah.
People would come next year thinking that there's gonna be another amnesty. I don't think so.
My guess is that about, 15% of the US population now is Hispanic or Latino background. Is that about right?
More like 18.
Is that going to grow?
Yeah,
Is the population going to spread into new areas?
the Latino population.
Into, say, Wisconsin or West Virginia or someplace like that?
Yeah, I think it's gonna spread across the whole country.
Is part of the problem, as people perceive the situation, is that the Latino crisis is primarily located in just a particular visible part of the country, southwest border?
Can you repeat the question?
Well, I mean, we know that there's a sizable population of Latinos in Illinois now.
Yeah,
But when you think about the population, you think about the people most irritated and concerned about this. They seem to be in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and places like that. I mean, is that accurate, or is that just a perception, or is it just a matter of the population changing rather than the perception's not changing? I mean, you think about border crossings, you don't think about people coming by boat to Mobile or someplace like that. You think of Texas, you think of the Southwest.
Honestly, I don't know about that, Larry, like how frustrated people are on the border with immigration as opposed to in Illinois. I mean, I can tell you that sometimes you can go to rural Illinois and not feel very welcome. I don't know.
Are there any questions out there? Anything we
Not online. Anybody in the room have anything? About
Okay,
5 minutes to wrap it up
I think
and
we can wrap it up. Is there any closing comments you want to make, Julia?
Yeah. That I think these people work really hard. And I met hundreds of them, more than hundreds, because with the recent project I met another 361 people that are working in this country. They work really hard, and we need to trust that if we give them a better opportunity for a better life here, they're gonna take full advantage of it. They're not here to commit crimes, they're not here to take advantage of the system, they're here to work hard. And I think, we should keep that in mind whenever we make any political decision about them.
Agree. Okay,
I did hear a stat today that I think was accurate. Trump's last immigration quota was 15,000, and the Biden administration wants to go to 125,000. So I think that's a dramatic improvement.
Yeah.
It's an interesting development. See what happens. Thank you all. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
We're gonna close it out. Do you want to say some final
Yeah,
words?
just say thank you. And on the bottom of the screen, we have our next guest, which will be at the 17th. We have Richard Hardy, who will talk about the Supreme Court.
Yep.
So that
That was
information.
postponed because of a health issue a
Yes.
couple of weeks ago.
And
So
now he's healthy and
he's fine.
he will be back. So you can look for us then. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more information or follow us on Facebook. Thank you, Julia. I learned a lot, so thank you.
Oh, that's good, thank you.
So go out there and ask some questions and have some good conversations. Good night.
It was a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
You bet. Thank you.
Wow, that was